Update 1.13 for Modern Warfare ended up actually having some weapon tweaks and adjustments that came along for the player base on Wednesday. While it wasn't anything like an M4A1 nerf or anything that completely shifted the meta tremendously, it did alter some weapons in areas that made them a bit more competitive for play, and thus makes me want to revisit the power rankings of weapons that we've discussed here in the past. Today, I want to run down my thoughts of the best weapons after Update 1.13, having played around with them and getting some more time under my belt since the update and their adjustments. Afterwards, I want to give you a few honorable mentions as well, because personally I think the divide between great guns and really good weapons of choice is a little gray, but then the drop off between the weapons that are good to, well, not so much. It's kind of a big divide. So the 10 or so weapons we'll talk about in total and discuss today, I personally think fall within just a few notches of the rankings of each other and could easily be changed out based upon personal preference, or even just a slight meta shift based upon maybe even game modes. But anyways, as we go along, what weapon do you think is the best? And likely because you'll say the M4 or MP5, what weapon outside of those two do you think is the best in the game? Let me know your thoughts down there in the comments, but also if you are new to the channel, maybe considering that subscribe button, as we're on that road to 300,000 subscribers, and we'll keep you up to date with all things Modern Warfare on a daily basis. But anyways, let's get into it. This top 5 is in no particular order when discussing the further rankings, though definitely still think the M4 and the MP5 are 1 and 2 respectively. Because it is common knowledge, just getting out there right now, right up front, the M4A1 is still the best in my opinion. It's not the fastest time to kill, it's not the highest damage output, it's not the fastest fire rate, but it's a really good competitor in all of those fields plus more. It's a jack of all trades weapon, the one that you can pick up and no matter your skill level, have a decent stat line at the end of the game. It's an entry-level gun that you can get hooked on a game for, or if you're a veteran, you can absolutely use the skill sets that you've learned from your time in the game to pummel the enemy with that weapon of choice. That really shouldn't come as a huge surprise. It's been that way since launch, since the beta and before, so to me, the M4A1 will reign supreme the entirety of the year. That's just my number 1 here at this. Number 2, though, same thing can really almost be said verbatim for the MP5. It's the M4 of the SMG category. It doesn't have the fastest fire rate, it doesn't have the longest damage range, but what it does have is some killer stats that can give those best-in-class leaders a run for their money, plus attachments that make it a fierce weapon in close quarters combat, offering, say, quicker ADS time, more damage output with the 10mm rounds and such, and it's a huge powerhouse of a weapon. Mobility, damage, and for an SMG, a surprisingly long effective range with the right attachments. This thing, again, is the meta weapon that I don't think will be dethroned anytime soon in the SMG category. So for that reason, 1 and 2 in my mind naturally go to these two. But now, what about the other weapons, the ones that are variable, maybe that have moved up or down the power rankings? These ones, again, I don't really have a huge set 3, 4, 5 number on them. They kind of vary, again, depending on the game mode, the map, what situations call for, because they do have some different skill sets than each other. One that I do want to mention right up front, though, is that of the FN Scar 17. This one was actually one of the weapons that was adjusted with Wednesday's update of Update 1.13, to which it actually did more than the listed changes that were made. What was said in the patch notes was that it decreased the horizontal recoil on the initial bullets of the FN Scar 17, meaning side to side. But what was also altered was that of the vertical recoil. This now has a much tighter recoil pattern comparative to where it was beforehand, and thus as a result, even base is way more manageable without any attachments on it. But if you end up throwing on grips, if you end up throwing on different barrels that add weight to it and mitigates recoil with that aspect as well, it's a much easier to control weapon. And that was one of the big things that always deterred the Scar from being one of the best rifles in my opinion, because it's a little bit of a slower weapon in terms of what mobility you have along with it, but also the fire rate. The damage was high, but the recoil was a little wild to control, and at range, it wasn't anything that I would have taken as my first choice of weapon. But now that it tightens this up, now that it makes it a little bit easier to be accurate, even at a distance, it's one that I think has moved its way up into the power rankings of the top 5 weapons. That damage, that tighter recoil, you're not going to be able to push in and run into every situation like you could with an MP5 or an M4A1, but you'll definitely be able to play a little bit more aggressively and maybe challenge a couple of more gunfights. You don't have to be so selective because of those stats that you previously knew of. To me, again, this one, while maybe not necessarily falling at a number 3 spot, I think now works its way up into those top 5 power rankings. Next, I want to talk about another weapon that I think has made its way over into the top 5, not one that we've mentioned before really in the top 5 aspect, but that being the Bison. Now, the PP19 Bison is one that definitely falls on the side of being in these rankings because it's been phenomenal for me as of lately. At the very beginning of the game, I wasn't really too much of a fan of it. I think that it did get some slight tweaking post-launch right afterwards, if my memory memory serves me correctly, but it was one that I just didn't use really because it just didn't suit my playstyle at that time. And so I kind of pushed it out of sight, out of mind type of deal. But as of going back and playing around with it, doing camo unlocks and weapon progression as of the last double XP weekend, it's absolutely phenomenal. It's probably got a mid-level fire rate, it's got a mid-level damage, but the biggest thing to me is the fact that close quarters, not only is it naturally a very speedy weapon to get your gun up, but the ammo reserve naturally is fantastic. It has the highest ammo pool and reserve bank of any of the SMGs, and so therefore you can literally go in, clear out a room of 4 or 5 people and still have ammo left over. That's an absolutely huge asset to me if you want to go in and play an SMG heavy game of clearing out rooms and being that gunner that just shreds through everybody. When you toss on attachments, it's been one of the most fun weapons I think as of recently to use, and therefore I definitely think, again, creeps its way over into that top 5. The final weapon that will round out the what I think is top 5 right now is that of a weapon we've discussed before, so I don't want to stay on it too long, but that being the Odin. Now, the Odin is, as we talked about before, the highest damage output rifle in the classification. There are, of course, weapons that do more damage per shot, sniper rifles, marksman rifles, but in terms of the automatic weapons, it's the highest in the rifle category. And as such, up until recently, you could actually even throw on stopping power rounds and make it a one-shot kill weapon class setup, but with the adjustments to stopping power, whether inadvertently or on purpose, it is something that made that impossible as the time being. We'll see if that has changed in the future, but the Odin has a relatively slower fire rate, so you are going to need to adjust your playstyle to be a little bit more passive. You're not going to be able to run in and be that first man in every situation, but if you find that balance of moving around the map, if you find that balance of being able to pick off enemies one by one, you're going to do so with absolute ease. One other downside with the Odin is that it doesn't have the highest ammo capacity to begin with, but you can throw on attachments to mitigate that and cancel that out. But it's a weapon that if you're accurate, if you end up having an aim that can go chest and up, you're going to shred through enemies with absolute ease, and it's not really going to take all that long. It does have the fastest time to kill of the rifles, so you can end up using that to your advantage. But that's the top 5 here that I think right now after update 1.13 are the weapons that reign supreme. But like we said, there's a lot that kind of fall within that general vicinity of these weapons and the power rankings. So I want to mention a couple of honorable mentions here with this. Firstly, let's start out with the AK-47. This one has, again, been relatively towards the top, I think, since the very launch of the game. Damage per shot wise, it's second best, I think, only to the Odin, and the recoil does have a decent amount of kick here with it, but it is something that if you can control that with whatever loadout you put on top of that, and you can be accurate, it is a weapon that absolutely shreds through enemies. It does have some very versatile builds that you can make, not only some of the classics like the AK-74U or the RPK, but you can make a whole bunch of different builds that can better suit your playstyle. So the AK-47 has always been one of my go-tos in terms of what I think is one of the best rifles, and it still sits atop that list, just maybe just on the outside looking in. Another one that has been, as of recently with Season 1 since it was introduced, a powerhouse that with the right loadouts, with the right attachments, can rival basically any playstyle you want, is the Ram 7. This one is way better whenever you get attachments on it, we'll say that for sure, but it is a weapon that can hold its own, got a little bit of a faster fire rate, and as such is pretty decent for close quarters and mid-range engagements. At long range, you're going to see some severe damage drop off though, so I wouldn't take it and try and have a battle with a sniper across the map or anything like that, but it can definitely hold its own. Another one that as of recently I've been a fan of and has actually been adjusted was the Mark II or MK2. This marksman rifle just had a recent adjustment to increase the bullet penetration, so that helps out with if you are shooting through walls or even shooting through other enemies, maybe say as a collateral, you'll be able to get a little bit more damage off on that one. But even though it is going to be semi-auto, even though it's going to require you to be a little more precise with your aim, it's absolutely fantastic if you can manage those two key components, because the rechamber speed and ADS speed are absolutely fantastic, so you can just pop enemies left, right, and center if you're that precise with that aim. Another weapon that I think is in the SMG category that is just right on the outside looking in is that of the MP7. We've talked about the MP7 a couple of times here on the channel, where the rate of fire, the potential that you have for ammo capacity, the damage output, and mobility overall is just something that makes this perfect storm for an SMG and a rush type player. It is a weapon that I've used quite a bit, and I love every second of using it for the most part, but on a personal level it's kind of taken a back burner because I've just been playing around with the Bison, and of course the MP5 still reigns supreme in that SMG category, but definitely one that is right there definitely give that a try if you haven't played around with it at all. And the final one, I want to throw kind of a little curveball in here with this, because it's a weapon that I don't use all that often, but damage profile wise and the ability to kill relatively fast in a lot of gunfights if you can get that gun up first, is the M91. The M91, of course, is an LMG, so it has a naturally higher damage output and a slower fire rate, slower mobility, and other things like that make it a more stationary weapon. But I've seen it used recently quite a bit more, whether that be people going for challenges or maybe a slight shift in the meta. Maybe their favorite pros or content creators recommended it, but it can pack a punch. I'll just say that and leave it at that. But ultimately, that is the top 5 weapons, and a couple of weapons that are some honorable mentions here after update 1.13. So that's where we're going to wrap it up. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts down there in the comment section down below. What weapon do you think is the best? And again, if it's outside of the M4 or the MP5, what weapon and why? Let me know your thoughts, but hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you drop a like down below. And of course, if you are new to the channel, make sure you guys subscribe so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Modern Warfare, updates, news, information, tips, tricks, all that good stuff. We got you covered here on the channel. So if any of that interests you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing. If you guys also want to follow over on Twitter and Instagram, there's the best places to get connected outside of YouTube. But I can live on both those, so if you guys want to strike up a conversation, ask me a question, whatever it may be, that link is down there in the description below. That said, thanks so much for watching. My name is Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care and peace.